students, today we are going to learn the lesson pollination and fertilization. You already learnt about the structure of flowers and various functions of each part of the flower. And you know that the stamens of a flower are the male organs and the pistil of the flower are female organs. The anthers of the anthers of the stamen produce powdery material called pollen, which consists of particles called pollen grains. They are small particles, children. They contain 2 sperm nuclei. They are actually the male cells. The 2 sperm nuclei only will participate in reproduction. For initiating this reproduction and the formation of fruits and seeds, the first step is pollination. So that is, the pollen grains must reach the stigma. By any ways, this pollen grain must reach the stigma. That is called the process of pollination. The process of pollination is the transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma. It takes place in 2 ways: self-pollination and cross-pollination. What is meant by self-pollination? The self-pollination is the process of transfer of pollen grains from anther to the stigma of the same flower. Autogamy. It is also called autogamy. Auto means self, gamy means marriage. And what is allogamy or cross-pollination? The process of transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma of another flower of another plant of the same species. Here plant is also different, flower is also different. That is called cross-pollination. You might ask me now, there is a chance of the pollen grain of the same plant but different flower, isn't it? So first kind you have learned the process of transfer of pollen grain from the anther to the stigma of the same flower. There is another kind you have learned now, the process of transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma of another flower of another plant of a same species. So these are 2 distinct things you have learned. Now there is another chance, that is the process of transfer of pollen grain from the anther to the stigma of a different flower but plant is same. Different flower of the same plant. So that's another chance. That is called geitonogamy. What is it here? Neighboring flower. The transfer of pollen grain from the anther to the stigma of the another flower of the same kind. Now you learn 3 kinds. Now you are going to learn all the 3 kinds definitions together. First one is autogamy or self-pollination. The process of transfer of pollen grain from the anther to the stigma of the same flower is self-pollination. The process of transfer of pollen grain from the anthers to the stigma of another flower of the same plant is geitonogamy. Gaetono means neighbor. Number 3 now. Allogamy. The process of transfer of pollen grain from the anther to the stigma of another flower of another plant of the same species. Got it? And it is also called as cross-pollination. Now you understood what is meant by pollination. Now, why this pollination should take place? The pollen grain should germinate, reach the ovule, then fertilization should take place. Then only fertilization will take place and fruit formation, and then come seed formation, then germination, then a new baby plant. This is the whole process of reproduction in plants. Now pollination may occur between plants of the same species. Suppose in a forest or in a big area, the pollen grain of the different species falls on the same stigma. Suppose you take in a forest, there are neem plants, eucalyptus, mango, various kinds like that. Suppose the pollen grain of the mango falls on a neem. then they perish. They don't survive because nature is so designed that flowers of the such a manner that only the pollen of the same species of plant will survive and grow further to continue the process of reproduction, and the pollen of the rest of the types will fail to germinate and perish. Now you are going to learn thoroughly about the two kinds of pollination. First, we are learning about self-pollination. Self-pollination is transfer of pollen from the anther to the stigma of the same flower. You have already learned. If it is same plant and another flower, then we call it as geitonogamy. You have learned, no children? Yes, now? Now, we are moving on to the advantages of the self-pollination. Self-pollination advantages, they are sure. First, pollination is sure. It is much surer in such bisexual flowers where stamens and carpel mature at the same time. Got it? And parental characters are preserved indefinitely. One generation to other generation, the parental characters, because the same pollen grain, same ovule, so same egg cell. So the parental characters will be preserved. There is no wastage of pollen grains. Even a small quantity of pollen will suffice. That is, it is sure, no, same house. It is whatever is cooked, we'll eat, isn't it? Suddenly guest comes, only a problem. Like that, here also, this pollen grain is self-pollination. Pollen grains, how much ever is the quantity produced, it is sure that it is going to pollinate. So it is economic to the plant. The flowers need not attract any of the insects or any of the agents. So they need not be large and showy. They need not produce scent, nectar, and need not be produced in large quantities. So which is very much economical to the plants. So all these advantages give great economy on the part of the plant. Is it clear? So very less production of pollen, production of nectar, scent, and having large petals, all that is saved. Now is it clear? Now there are some disadvantages also. So what are the disadvantages of the self-pollination? So continued self-pollination, generation after the generation, one generation to other generation, 10 generations like that. That may lead to weakening of the variety or the species. The seeds produced through it are very poor in quality and give rise to less vigorous offsprings. Offsprings means here they are the baby plants. The weaker or defective characters of the variety or breed cannot be eliminated. The same is continued, no? So it cannot be eliminated. It does not yield new varieties. When there is no scope of mixing with any other gametes of the different plants, so there is no chance of producing new variety also. The genetic traits of the same plants with no change and without any intermixing are passed on to the next generation, and thus there is a little chance of improvement in the next generation. With all these children, with all these advantages, disadvantages, nature sometimes, nature what it does, it favors or promotes the self-pollination. Now all plants, no, they don't wait for cross-pollination only. Sometimes nature promotes, nature favors self-pollination. What are those things which are favoring self-pollination? First one is geitonogamy. Stigma of anther of the same flower, that is same species, same plant. Neighboring flowers will get pollinated. That is geitonogamy. Geitonogamy is one of the thing where pollination between flowers of the same plant and flowers are different. They have common genetic characters, isn't it? And there is another thing, if the flowers are bisexual, bisexuality. Bisexuality means the flower having, you are already learnt, the flower having both male and female organs in the same flower. So they need not go in search of anther They need not go in search of pollen grains, etc. So pollen grain is readily available. Stigma is also readily available in the same flower. So that is one of the thing which the self-pollination is promoted. Got it? Now the third thing what is that is pollination taking place in closed flowers. Sometimes due to various reasons the flowers will never open at all. They remain closed even after the maturity. The reproductive structures, anther, the stigma and all remain hidden and lies close to each other. So they facilitate self-pollination as an external pollinating agents are not required at all. Such things definitely self-pollination. That is called cleistogamy. Usually it occurs in pea, pansy, etc. Got it, children? Any two examples of cleistogamy, pea and pansy. Is that clear? So first one what you have learnt, geitonogamy. Next one what you have learnt is bisexuality. Now what you have learnt is cleistogamy, where the flowers will never open, that is pollination occurring in a closed flowers. Now we are moving to the fourth one, how nature facilitate self-pollination. That is homogamy. That is to ensure self-pollination, the anther and stigma of a flower, they mature at the same time. They don't take their own time to mature. Both will mature at the same time, and that is how the pollination is facilitated. Which pollination? Self-pollination. Is that clear, children? Now, cross-pollination. Cross-pollination is a transfer of pollen from the anthers of flowers from one plant to the stigma of a flower of another plant of the same species. Here you have to understand it is of the same species. Got it? Here the large petals, large flowers exposed to the reproductive structures. Got it? That is why these are called chasmogamous flowers. Got it? They are all called as chasmo. chasmogamous, chasmogamous flowers. You can also call them chasmogamous. Such flowers require external pollinating agents such as this wind, water, insects particularly. Sometimes birds, man also does the pollination. They are called agents of pollination. What are the advantages of cross-pollination? The offsprings are healthier. Whereas we have learned self-pollination, the offsprings are weaker. Here offsprings are healthier. The seeds produced are abundant and viable. They are viable, strong, and new varieties may be produced by cross-pollinating two different varieties of the same species, or even two distinct species. Nowadays they are finding two different species also, they are able to cross-pollinate. Got it, children? So new varieties, because two different varieties are cross-pollinated, so they give new varieties, but this advantage is not there with the self-pollination. There are certain disadvantages also. They are disadvantages of cross-pollination. Now we are going to learn. The pollination is not always certain, because some pollinating agents is always needed, which may or may not be available at the proper time. Insects may not be available, or wind may not blow at that time, all that. The pollen has to be produced in large quantity to ensure maximum chances of pollination, which means a lot of wastage of pollen grain. See, the wind blows, lot of pollen blows, no, children? When they are blowing, they might fall on the tables, stools, or on the ground. They might get wasted, isn't it? It is not sure that they go to stigma and then fall there and the pollination takes place. We can't give any guarantee there. So no surety. Whereas in bisexual flowers, same flower have the pollen grain as well as anther. We have surety. That is one of the advantage of self-pollination. Here we are not sure. and the process is very uneconomical for the plant because the flowers must be large, showy, colored, brightly colored, scent, and have to produce nectar for attracting pollinating agents like insects. If they are not attractive, the insects will not come near, isn't it, children? So they have to be very attractive also. Now sometimes nature favors cross pollination. How nature favors self pollination? By various means. Similar way, by various means nature also favors cross pollination. The vast majority of flowers prefer plants for cross pollination. Got it? The vast variety of flowering plants, they prefer cross pollination. Is got it? Some various devices or conditions are there, such as unisexuality, dichogamy, self sterility, hercogamy, etc. Got it? Now we are going to learn about unisexuality. The flowers may be either male or female, and they may be born on separate plants. In this way, cross pollination is the only possibility. Got it? Examples: palms and papaya plants usually have separate male and female trees, but less frequently there may also be hermaphrodite tree. That is, you have learnt monoecious, both kinds of flowers in the same flower. In cucumber gourd, male and female flowers may be born on the same plant. This facilitates the cross pollination. Now we are going to the second condition where cross pollination is facilitated. Dichogamy, different timings of maturation of androecium and gynoecium. Here homogamy, opposite is dichogamy. In self pollination you have learnt homogamy, where anther and stigma of a flower mature at the same time. You have learnt just now. Here it is exactly opposite. Different timings of maturation of androecium and gynoecium. In many bisexual flowers, the anther and the stigma of the same flower mature at different timings. In some plants, anther of the flowers mature earlier than the stigma, and such condition is called protandry. The ladyfinger, sweet pea, salvia, sunflower. In some plants, the stigma of the flower matures earlier than the anthers. That is called protogyny. Pro means first. So protandry is androecium maturing earlier. Protogyny means gynoecium maturing early. Got it? Proto means first and gyne means female. Is that clear? So custard apple, people, etc. So the two conditions in dichogamy you have learnt is protandry and protogyny. Dichogamy means different timings of maturation of androecium and gynoecium. If the androecium matures first, then we call it as protandry. If gynoecium matures first, we call it as protogyny. In such cases, the cross pollination is the only alternate left for them. Is it not? Now, the third condition you are learning is self-sterility. This is the condition in which even if the stigma receives pollen from the anther of the same flower, got it? The pollen fails to undergo further growth. It will fail. It will not go and germinate. In such cases, only the pollen from another plant of the same species can effectively complete the process of setting of the seeds. Examples are orchids. Is that clear, children? Now we are moving to hercogamy. Hercogamy means, hercos means barriers. A mechanical or structural obstruction, barrier will be there where they stop the self-pollination. In some flowers, the pollen of a flower cannot reach the stigma of the same flower. Got it? A hood covering the stigma acts like a mechanical barrier in flower. Example, pansy or iris. Got it? In such flowers, the stigma will be either small or big. You can clearly see in the diagram 1 unisexuality. This is a male flower and this is the female flower. In this you can see dichogamy. Here androecium matures first. Here gynoecium matures first. And self-sterility. Suppose the pollen grain of the same flower falls also, they will not germinate. This is self-sterility. Now we are moving on to hercogamy. Here you can see hood-like structure which prevents the self-pollination and promote only cross-pollination. Now we are moving to the fifth condition called hetero-stylee. Hetero-stylee, in such flowers, the stigma and anthers grow at different heights which does not favor self-pollination. Example, primrose, oxalis, etc. Here you can see in this flower, the style is very long here and androecium or stamina here. Another flower of the same flower species, you will find gynoecium very short stigma and androecium here. Can you see? Hetero means different. Different heights of the style. Got it? So, primrose, oxalis are example for the hetero-stylee. Now we are moving to differences between self-pollination and cross-pollination. Self-pollination and cross-pollination. In self-pollination, the transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma of the same flower takes place. Whereas in cross-pollination, the transfer of pollen grains from anther of the one flower to the stigma of another flower of a different plant of the same species, that is also called as allogamy. Now in autogamy, external agency is not required. Got it? In self-pollination, we don't require any agent of pollination. Whereas in cross-pollination, we require an external agents like water, wind, insect. It is always required, children. Without agent, the pollination cannot be taking place. In self-pollination, male and female parts mature at the same time. In cross-pollination, the male and female parts, namely anther and stigma, mature at different times. And this condition of male and female parts maturing at the same time in the self-pollination is called homogamy. Anthers and stigma mature at different times and this condition is called dichogamy. And self-pollination can occur even when flower is closed. Cross-pollination can occur only when the flower is open. Self-pollination preserves parental characters and cross-pollination does not preserve parental characters. In self-pollination, new variations are impossible. Hence, young ones cannot adopt to change environmental conditions. That means, if the regular conditions are there, they can adopt. Sudden changes, they cannot adapt. They will perish. But whereas in cross-pollination, offsprings are very healthier and they can adopt to any kind of environmental changes. Any environmental changes, they adopt. And in self-pollination, no new varieties are produced. Whereas in cross-pollination, new varieties can be produced. Once again, the differences between self-pollination and cross-pollination. In self-pollination, the transfer of pollen grains from the anthers to the stigma of the same flower, autogamy, takes place. In cross-pollination, the transfer of the pollen grains from the anthers of the one flower to the stigma of another flower of a different plant of the same species takes place and is called as allogamy. In self-pollination, no external agency or agent is required. In cross-pollination, an external agent like wind, water, insect is always required. In self-pollination, male and female parts mature at the same time, homogamy. In cross-pollination, anthers and stigma mature at different times, dichogamy. In self-pollination, it occurs even when the flower is closed. Cross-pollination can occur only when flower is open. Self-pollination can preserve parental characters. the original characters can be preserved, whereas in cross-pollination, the parental characters cannot be preserved. They always get mixed. And in self-pollination, new varieties are impossible. Hence, young ones cannot adapt to changed environmental conditions. Offsprings are healthier in cross-pollination, so they adapt to the environmental changes. In self-pollination, new varieties are not possible, whereas new varieties can be produced in cross-pollination. Thank you, children. You will get your assignment in a description box.